So here's an example of the poetry of Emily Dickinson. This is one of her most famous works, certainly most well known, Because I Could Not Stop for Death. So I'll read it, then we'll discuss it. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun. Or rather, he passed us. The dews drew quivering and chill, for only gossamer, my gown, my tippet, only toll. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice and the ground. Since then, 'tis centuries, and yet feel shorter than the day. I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity.
Oh, I love that poem. That's such a good poem.
It is. It is. I wasn't sure how to read this. If that's a pause or
just read 'em.
What?
It's a pause. Yeah, it's a pause. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and
Okay,
immortality.
well, that's better than how I did it. This is a learning experience, right?
Yeah.
So what should we look for here? We've noted the style, one of her stylistic points, the dashes between the lines.
Yeah. This was one of her more rhythmic poems. So, as far as nobody was doing dashes like this, she's crazy with dashes all over the place in this, and that's what was considered weird about her poetry was that who dashes, and by today's standards, you look at it and you go, what's the big deal with the dash? But by those days, it was almost scandalous. That's not the
They didn't have a lot to do.
No.
They're freaking out over dashes.
Well, I mean, you got to remember for a long, long time, poetry was it. It was the Bible or it was poetry. No one was writing novels or short stories or anything. Short stories and novels really didn't, once the printing press took off and then everybody had to learn how to read, and then people started writing novels and short stories. So poetry was still very much a big deal back then. Lots of people wrote poetry and lots of books were published, and so it was there was a way to do it. Everybody just thought they were critical.
Well, she was a contemporary of Dickens, Charles Dickens, if my memory is serving correctly. I mean,
different context.
Yeah, I mean, but there would have been. I mean, it wasn't like years between what was written in England and what was published in America. They got it fairly quickly.
Yeah.
So I mean,
like I said, it was
short stories and other things of that nature.
Yeah, I wasn't trying to imply that it wasn't there. I'm just saying that poetry was considered the equal of it.
Okay.
If you went down to the bookstore, you were just as likely to buy a book of poetry as you were to buy a book.
Okay.
Or a novel or something. That's all
I wanted to clear that up. I knew what you were saying, but
Yeah, it's only nowadays that it's really kind of a dying art form.
It really is.
Yeah.
So let's address some terms here. Let's talk some poetry. So these are called stanzas, right? Well, I wasn't really asking, but these are all called stanzas. These separate little paragraphs, and that's poetry, and
they're all quatrains, which means the grouping of four lines.
That's right. I wouldn't say there's a particular rhyme scheme that holds true throughout the whole poem, unless I just totally missed it.
No, No, it has some rhyme to it, but it's mostly the rhythm that draws you through the poem.
Right. Right. So what's this poem about?
Well, I always thought
You
of it
just tell
like,
it better than I do.
you know,
Yeah, what's this poem about?
yeah. Because I could not stop for death, it means to me that she was too busy living her life. You know, she wasn't ready to die. She wasn't prepared to die, but die she did. You know, so but because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. Do you get it?
Mhm.
Okay. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. So in death comes an immortality, because immortality means that you're going to live forever. So it's kind of this contradiction in terms. It's kind of an ironic statement in that we're dead, but we're going to live forever dead.
So is she expressing here some sort of belief in a higher power? I mean, was that principle
Yes.
at Holyoke totally wrong?
Um,
She had no hope at all.
I think that she believed in God. I think um, but she didn't believe in God in the puritanical Calvinistic way.
Right.
She would have been more of a Unitarian,
Define Unitarian.
which it was a church that Ralph Waldo Emerson was actually a preacher in one. He was the minister of a Unitarian church. They found God in nature.
Okay.
You know, so they tended to find God in the things around them, and in the things that happen, not necessarily in ideas and behavior. You know,
Mm-hmm.
like most, it was very those churches were very traditional. Unitarians were not traditional at all. They were considered kind of weird. Like the Puritans considered the Quakers weird.
Right.
Okay.
That's a history lesson again for another class.
Yeah. So she's going on now. Obviously, in death there is no body, so it's just the soul. So her soul is in this carriage, and the soul is going to be living for immortality forever. So that's immortality. Okay. We slowly drove. He knew no haste. What we're
Why
dead.
would he?
What's the rush? Yeah. And I had put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility. So, because she's dead, she has all the things that kept her busy in life. She has now put those things away. She's dead, you know? So, but death here is being kind of portrayed as a kindly carriage driver. You get the impression that it's just an older gentleman who pulled up outside her house in a carriage, you know, and helped her in, and was carrying on a conversation with her as they're driving down the road.
You, just to reference that Apple show, I know we've both watched it. Death is portrayed by Wiz Khalifa.
Yeah.
Definitely off the mark. From
Yeah.
from this.
Yeah. I don't think Emily was thinking of a character like Wiz Khalifa.
Khalifa, yeah.
Yeah, Khalifa.
So yeah, she's dead.
But it's an interesting interpretation of it, and it was kind of I thought it was
Yeah.
Although the series as a whole is weird, but
As is our author, or as was our author.
Yeah. So we passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun. So I kind of look at this like, all right, like the seasons. It starts off with children, and then it goes to the metaphor then becomes fields of grazing grain.
Grazing grain.
Yeah. So you start off, they drive by a school where children, so young, you're in the first part of life. And then you go by gazing grain. Now, grain at that state would be in its prime. So they go from young, then they go to middle life, the grain, and then the setting sun then becomes
Old age.
death. Yeah, old age. So she's passed through all those phases. Okay. Or rather, he passed us. Okay. Because she's dead.
So none of these things are
Does
actually
that make
happening.
sense? Yeah. The dews drew quivering and chill, for only gossamer my gown, my tippet, only tulle. Now, what she's talking about there is really the next two passages or quatrains or stanzas are kind of morbid in a way, because what she's talking about is she's talking about being buried. Okay, so she's not passing anybody really, because she's buried in a coffin,
Right.
you know. And the gossamer is the way they dressed them at that time. Those were the funeral clothing. It was always a gossamer gown or a made out of tulle. Okay, so it was always white. It was always very light. So she says the dews drew quivering and chill. So she's only got this gossamer gown on, and so she's chilly. And she's in the ground because there's dew.
So could this poem also just be read as a horse pulling a funeral casket to a gravesite?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great idea. Yeah.
Okay.
But now she's at the grave. And it's not necessarily a grave, because she says, we paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. Now, back in these days, you had the mausoleums, right? Or you had the little sepulchers, the little houses that they would build in cemeteries that they would put the casket.
So what you're trying to say is people were buried above ground. There were family vaults.
Yeah, this is like
in a lot of cases.
Right.
Yeah.
But a lot of times these buildings, what they did was they would build them and then they would bury the back end of it. So it would be a swelling in the ground, and you would only see the front end of the building. And that was the only, you'd have to walk around the hill, the swelling of the ground, to see the front end of the building. And then that would be where you would open the door and go in and see the caskets sitting there. So that's what she's describing here. She's describing that we paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. So they're behind it, and the roof was scarcely visible because they're looking over the hill, the little swelling of the ground. And at the top of the swelling of the ground, they can just see they can see the building outline of the roof of the building. Yeah. Okay. And then the cornice then would be in the ground, so she's not, it's kind of interesting because it takes us into this area of, well, there's dew and gossamer, and she's quivering, because of the material that she's wearing. And that would give you the impression that she's buried in the ground. But then the next stanza talks about being buried in a sepulcher. So it's kind of interesting. I don't know if she was just, the first one was just the lead into the second one, or she's just talking about different ways of being buried.
I can read it both ways.
Yeah. But then she ends it with, since then 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day. I first surmise the horses' heads were toward eternity. Which I just
it doesn't
love.
feel like a long time at all since she died. But it's been centuries.
She says it's been centuries, but it seems like a day. Because when you're immortal and there's no end of the time.
Does time exist?
Centuries can go. Yeah, does time exist? Centuries just go by, and you don't know that it's been centuries.
That's good, isn't it?
And yeah. Unless you have something to measure it by, and she's saying No, there's nothing there to measure time by.
Hmm.
There's no way to judge the passing of time.
That's good. All right. What you wanted to do one more?